Right. Welcome, everybody. So, I'm Kate Allen, and I'm the co-creator of All About Inclusion. And maybe I'll just tell you a little bit about myself and how I came to be here today doing the grief, loss, and mourning. But before I do that, I just want to invite all of you to share in the chat where you're joining us from. If you are from an organization, feel free to share your organization and what you do. And I'd also love to know what drew you to want to be here today, if you'd like to share that. So, and anything else that you'd love to share with us in the chat, please do. So, like to get to know you a little bit. And now I'll just share a little bit about what brought me here today. So I've been working in the disability support sector for over a decade, doing things like respite, direct support profession work, management, recreation coordination. And at this point, I work as a consultant, trainer, and facilitator with All About Inclusion. And I've supported many people through loss. I think I'm going to venture out on a limb and say every person that I've supported has experienced loss and needed support with that. I've also supported people through their end of life process, and end of life care and grief tending are something that are very important to me and a special interest of mine. And, I'm grateful to have received training on things like the end of life doula certification through Douglas College, the Learning Essential Approaches to Palliative Care through Pallium, hospice and palliative care training as a hospice volunteer, and much more. So I'm here today because this topic has been coming up in our work almost constantly. And it came to a point where it was like something that was being brought up, or we were coming up to every week and sometimes every day. So at that point, I realized it's really time to do this webinar and offer, a little bit of support on this topic to our community. Now, I just want to look in the chat and see what you all are sharing. So we have Jill. Welcome, Jill. And I'm going to apologize if I say something wrong or pronounce wrong, but we have someone from a residential support. Welcome. And we have a family member. Welcome. I'm just not saying, I realize I'm not going to see your names because I'm recording it, but know that I'm reading all of your comments and I'm welcoming you. And we have someone from a local work program that we love, and so much more. I am loving what you're sharing. Thank you so much. Some of you are sharing that you're supporting people through losses and that you have also experienced tough personal losses. And I just want to say that that's all very welcome here today. And, some people are sharing that you're feeling a little bit not prepared to offer this support. So I'm hoping that what we offer you today can help. So, wow, thank you all for sharing in the chat, and know that it's all welcome here today. I am going to share with you a little bit about All About Inclusion, because I know some of you know who we are and what we do, and many of you don't. So we're a small business, a small organization. We think of ourselves as a community of professionals, and we're dedicated to cultivating inclusion for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We do this by offering free and pay what you can resources and events such as this. And we also share some free resources and other supports on our website and in our newsletter. And then on the paid side of things, we offer training, consultation, and facilitation on things like supported decision-making, visual communication strategies, trauma-informed care, building community, disability-specific training like autism, and so much more. And we work with individuals, families, and organizations. The two of us who are the core of All About Inclusion are also family members. So that's myself, and that's Paula. Hello, Paula. And so or I'll say I have grew up with three brothers with developmental disabilities. So that's part of what has drawn me to do the work that I'm doing. We also dedicate a significant amount of time and other resources to advocacy work. We both feel very passionately about being a part of bringing about change in the sector so that our loved ones can thrive. And before we go any further, I just want to take a moment and offer a land acknowledgement. And I'm here today in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded land of the Mi'kmaq, in what is often known as Nova Scotia. And I feel that it's important to offer this acknowledgement because I want to offer my gratitude to the people that have cared for this land for longer than I can even imagine. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And on the note of gratitude, I just want to offer a little bit more gratitude to some of the teachers in the world that have offered their wisdom on grief tending. And some of those that have been particularly meaningful to me are Dr. Frances Weller, who wrote the book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow. Oh, and if you're interested in any of these, when I send the follow-up email, I will list any books and other resources that I'm referencing. So don't feel like you have to rush to write them down or anything. So another one is David Kessler and his many works on grief tending. He also worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was the creator of the 5 stages of dying, or people often think of it as the 5 stages of grief. Megan Devine and her book, It's Okay to Not Be Okay, and other training like the End of Life Doula at Douglas College, Hospice Halifax, thank you, and a shout out to them, Pallium and their LEAP program, and the Canadian Virtual Hospice. And there is a really good resource on there specifically for people supporting people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and I'll point you to that as well. I also want to say that, and some of you have shared this in the chat, talking about some of this stuff can be challenging for us. So we want to make sure that we're tending to the needs of our uniquely storied bodies, minds, and hearts as we're going through this. So depending on your experiences with grief and loss, some of these subjects might touch a really tender place. So feel free to take a break. Do whatever feels supportive to self-regulate. And it's also okay to leave and come back and watch the recording. So just tend to whatever feels right for you. We're going to be here for an hour and a half, for just a little bit less than that now. And I'm going to open up some space for questions and discussion at the end. But if you have any questions or anything you want to offer to the discussion, definitely feel free to share in the chat anytime. Either, so if you put a question in the chat, either I'll do my best to answer it then, or I might save it for the end as well. But know that I will do my best to answer it at some point during the presentation. And I also want to say that for anyone that can't stay until the end, where we'll talk a little bit about connecting, I just wanted to put our email address there now, just in case you'd like to know how to connect with us. Yes. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about what grief is and what it can look like, how to talk about death and loss in a supportive way, and we're going to talk about some supportive strategies that we can use and some example rituals of mourning. And of course, at the end, we will open it up for a little bit of discussion and questions. So what is grief? Grief's an emotion we feel when we experience loss. It can feel very heavy, and sometimes it can feel like it's never going to go away. When I'm grieving, it can feel like there's a weight on my chest that's heavy and weighing me down. And grief often comes in waves. So sometimes it can feel like sometimes we can feel almost normal, and then other times we can feel intense emotional pain. Dr. Francis Weller, in his work, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, shares that there can be many different layers to grief. Or many different doorways to grief. And the most common one is losing the people, things, and places that we love. Another one is what we expected and did not receive. And the places within us that have not known love. And another one that's particularly poignant right now, I think, is feeling grief for the sorrows of the world. So, for example, right now, there is a lot of grief surrounding climate change. And finally, ancestral or intergenerational grief. So that can be for things like loss of culture, loss of language, loss of ancestral homelands and land. Yes, so those are some different layers, but when we're talking about grief, we're going to get a little bit more specific and narrow in a bit more on the losses that are particularly poignant for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. But know that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities feel grief in the same way that we all feel grief. So we feel grief when we experience loss. Some of the different losses that a person might experience are someone we know or love dying, someone we know or love changing or getting sick. So this could be things like a car accident, cancer, dementia, and more. Another one is someone we know or love leaving our life. So moving away, a support person getting a new job. We can also feel loss when our everyday life changes. So that could be moving, it could be losing a job, a volunteer activity, or the ending of an event that lasted over a certain amount of time. And another one is aging. So sometimes, not sometimes, but if we age, we all will likely experience our health declining in some way, may lose abilities. Like there may be things that we could do at one point and can no longer do. And a really good book relating to that is one called Being Mortal by Atal Gawande, and it's very, very good. So some other things that we can feel lost surrounding is missing out. So that could be something like even an outing is canceled that a person was looking forward to. Maybe a support worker called in sick and they can no longer attend it. A really, really, really common one for people who require a support person is feeling the loss of a support person leaving. And some people living with intellectual and developmental disabilities will experience this loss 100 or even many more times in their life. And often that relationship ends right at that moment, and it can be very abrupt feeling. Another one is a lack of opportunities. So not being able to find a job, friends, a romantic relationship, especially when people can see that the people around them have that. That can definitely be a loss. Another one could be a roommate or a housemate leaving, and a routine changing. So maybe staffing changes, or maybe a caregiver's work schedule changes, and all of a sudden the routine needs to change. That can also be a loss. And I just want to name that many of these losses, like just because a person feels loss doesn't mean that someone has done something wrong. Loss and grief are part of the human experience. So there's no one alive that has not experienced loss or grief in some way. It is part of life, and again, it doesn't mean that we've done something wrong for a person to be feeling grief. So what does grief look like? It can look like some of the most, I'm going to say, it can look very typical. So that can be things like sadness, crying, anger, numbness and apathy, loneliness, feeling tired, depressed. A really, really common one for many people is keeping busy. So, and there's nothing right or wrong. It's some people might think that a person's avoiding the loss, but sometimes that's exactly what the person, like keeping busy is exactly what the person needs to do. And grief can also express itself physically. So that can be things like fatigue, headache, stomach ache, heaviness in the chest. And grief can also look like changes in behavior, sleep disturbances. So either not being able to sleep well or sleeping, it could also be sleeping like a much higher amount. It can also look like agitation or aggression, and we would be most likely to see that when a person doesn't have uh, a really good way or process for communicating their loss. So yeah, that's not the only time that we may see it, but a person who struggles with communication, we may be more likely to see it there. And we may also see fear, dysregulation, increased stimming, and self-regulation attempts. So stimming is an attempt to self-regulate. And we may also see grief expressed as comfort seeking. So that looks very different for every person. So I know one person who that would look like trying to get wanting toys, right? Toys are very comforting. So if this person were feeling very upset, they might be asking or wanting toys. Another person, it might be hugs or be piled under a blanket now. So it does look very different for every person. So at this point, you might be wondering, is there a right way to grieve? And the answer is no. There isn't a right way to grieve. There's only the way that's right for the person. So for many of us, when we're thinking about grieving, the 5 stages of grief might come to mind, and they were by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. That's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So what many people don't realize is that those 5 stages of grief were actually meant to be the 5 stages that a person dying from a terminal illness goes through. They were never meant to be applied to grieving in a way that says that it's linear or to be a map to grieving well. With that being said, it wouldn't be at all uncommon for a person to go through and alternate between all those different stages. But it's really important to know that it's not a linear process. There's no set steps that a person has to go through in order to grieve well. So it's a very, very individual process, and there's no one right way to do it. And often we'll alternate between feeling almost normal and then be hit by a wave of grief or a feeling associated with it. And it often comes and goes in intensity over time. There's also there's no timeline on grief. So grieving takes as long as it takes, though ideally a person's able to start building a life out of their new normal. I've also heard it said that the grief that we feel doesn't really get smaller, but what happens is we build a life around it. And, looking back at my own experiences and the experiences of others, I think there's probably something to that. And I'll just name that I see a question that was sent to me, and I will definitely save that for the end. I love that question. I just want to acknowledge that I see it. Okay. So let's talk about some times where, as a support person, you might need to get some outside or extra help supporting someone. So one of those times might be if a person is experiencing a complicated grief. This is sometimes known as prolonged grief disorder. And it's usually diagnosed at least 6 months to a year following a major loss. It can look like intense yearning, avoidance of reminders of the person or the loss, inability to find a new normal in their life, intense loneliness, and more. In people living with intellectual and developmental disabilities, it can actually look similar to other mood disorders. So things like depression, anxiety. It's also important to note that more study is needed on diagnosing and treating complicated grief for people living with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And current research has shown that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are more likely to develop complicated grief or complex grief. And there are some risk factors, and most of these are from a study. And when I send the follow-up email, I will include that study in case anyone wants to geek out a little bit and read that. So some of the risk factors are like a sudden loss. So a sudden loss as opposed to an anticipated loss. Secondary losses. So let's, for example, say a person lives with their primary caregiver, who is their mother. And if their mother dies, that person is also losing their caregiver. They're also losing potentially their advocate, their everyday life and routine changes. And in a lot of cases, they are also losing their home and their whole way of life because oftentimes, if a person is living with their one and only primary caregiver and that caregiver dies, they then need to transition to a supported environment. So those are very, very significant secondary losses. So another risk factor is unacknowledged or disenfranchised grief, masking or hiding the grief. And we know that people living with intellectual and developmental disabilities are often valued more by society when they're happy, easygoing, they're upbeat, things like that. So people are often conditioned to want to hide those challenging feelings if they can. So masking or hiding the grief is something that does happen. Other risk factors are insufficient self-regulation skills, communication challenges. So do they have a way to communicate about the loss? And another one is exclusion from bereavement rituals. So that could be things like funeral, burial, memorial, wake, and other cultural expressions of bereavement. Actually, I want to go back for a quick sec. There are some other situations where we might need to enlist some extra help or outside help. One of those is if the person we're supporting communicates using behaviors that challenge, that start to become unmanageable in the current level of support, or if we're not sure how to support those. And another situation would be if there's something medical. So might there be depression or anxiety that's clinical, like a clinical level, or any other medical reason you would seek, medical, you would go to the doctor or a primary care or whatever. And of course, if a person is talking about suicide, expressing thoughts or plans, you would also always reach out to the appropriate supports. Okay, so let's talk about some of the things that we can do before a major loss occurs and what some of those protective factors are. So a few of the protective factors that can help protect someone from experiencing complex or complicated grief are prior knowledge or education on death and bereavement rituals. So, do they understand what death is? Do they know the purpose of, or have they participated in any bereavement rituals in the past, like a funeral or a wake? Another one is inclusion in bereavement rituals. So if a loss were to occur, being included in bereavement rituals can help protect against experiencing complicated grief. Having a means to communicate about a loss and having a circle of support. So let's say we want to help a person have an understanding of death and rituals of mourning. How might we do that? It can be a challenging thing to talk about for sure, and many people are not comfortable talking about death. So it can help to find everyday moments where you can talk about it in concrete ways. So some examples of that might be if you're watching a movie or a TV show. And that TV show might show someone dying in some way, or it might show a ritual of mourning or bereavement, like a funeral. Even Disney movies do show death in some way. I mean, I think we most of us maybe have seen Bambi, that part where Bambi's mother dies. That's a doorway into talking about death, right? Some other everyday moments might be the death of an animal. So, even as gross as this is, roadkill could be a doorway into talking about death. A tree being cut down, that could be a doorway into that conversation. A bug dying. Um, or maybe there's a community event honoring someone who's died, seeing the flags being half-mast. So they can all be opportunities to show both how, community expressions of bereavement and rituals of mourning. These can also be really good opportunities to gauge the person's level of understanding about death and to know what their beliefs are surrounding death and life after death, and whether or not they have any, or what their spiritual connections are. So another thing that we can do prior to a major loss occurring is making sure that the person has a way to communicate. So for people that communicate verbally, this can be a little bit less of a challenge, a little bit. What it might look like is making sure they have the language surrounding death and mourning and an understanding of like the bereavement rituals and what death is. For someone that doesn't communicate using words and maybe uses visuals, you may want to have visual supports and other means of communication ready. So if someone communicates using visuals, you want to make sure that maybe they have some stories, some visual stories to understand what death is, and some of the rituals of mourning, or bereavement, like a funeral. And you also want to make sure that there's a means of talking about death if they have questions. So you might want to have some visuals that can be used for them to say, I want to learn, or I want to talk about this, or I want to read this visual story. Another thing is that if someone is sick and is going to die, it can be helpful to have visual supports ready ahead of time so that you don't have to rush to make them in the moment. But there is a caveat to that. Like if it's someone that it can be real, or that you care about, it can be really challenging to make that story and to see it. So do what's right for you. Um, just with the understanding of it can be very difficult to put this stuff all together in the moment that you need it. And it often requires a significant amount of thought to get it right. Another thing that we can do before a major loss occurs is we can really focus on teaching, modeling, and practicing self-regulation. And this can help in every area of life. And that definitely includes while in the process of mourning a loss. And on the supporter side of things, having an understanding of and a comfort in practicing co-regulation can be a key support strategy. Another thing that we can do before a major loss occurs is we can help to build a circle of support. And ideally, this will include unpaid friends and community members. And I know this at times is easier said than done. If you want to learn more about that, we do have a free webinar on that and some free resources. And I can link to that in the email that we send out afterwards. And finally, we want to make sure before a major loss occurs that a person has access to spiritual community or practice if they desire. And if they've never experienced anything like that, they may not know if they desire it or not. So sometimes that looks like, teaching someone what that is, trying out different options and things like that. So I just wanted to share this example of a visual support. This one was made by Scope, which is an organization in the UK. I'm not really familiar with their work, but this resource that they've created is fabulous. It's a whole booklet, and the whole first half of it is visual supports like this to help someone understand, death, loss, grief, all that stuff. So again, I'll link to this in the email I sent out. But I thought this was a great example, showing the cycle of life. So all living things are born, grow, and die. Some people get very old and die. Some people die after an accident, and some people die because they're very sick. But not all people who get sick die. Most people get well. So and they include visuals for all of them, nice plain language. I really think it's great. I think if you look through it, you'll think so as well. Okay, so let's look at when a loss does occur. One of the first things we want to look at is what are the secondary losses? So some examples of what secondary losses would be is one of the ones we've already talked about. So let's say a parent caregiver dies, the person is losing their parent, but they might also lose their family home, their advocate, their caregiver, their routine, the activities they did together, like going to the market every Saturday morning, and much, much more. If a person is experiencing the loss of a support worker leaving, that person loses that relationship in their life, but they can also end up losing the activities that they did together, the topics they would talk about, and the routine that they had together. So if, let's say, someone leaves who always took the person to a particular museum and none of the other support workers did that, you may want to support by asking, do you still want to go to this place, and assuring that they're not just losing the person, but also losing that activity that they loved. Um, Finances are sometimes a secondary loss as well. So sometimes, a person might lose someone who was giving them, you know, money to do certain things, and they may no longer have the money to do those when that person is gone. So those are losses as well. To figure out the secondary losses, I find it helpful to look at what the loss looks like in everyday life. So what did they do together? When did they see each other? What did the person do for the person you support? And it's also helpful to look at the person's history of loss. So, what or who have they lost in their past? What do they understand about death? Have they experienced profound losses in their life? And we should also remember that grief often brings other past losses to the surface, and that trauma can also play a role in this. Now let's talk about how how we might talk to a person about death or loss. And one of the first things we want to remember is that, um, excuse me, we want to make it concrete. So phrases like lost, passed on, an angel now. I've also heard they've gone to sleep. Those are all quite abstract. While something like Grampy was sick, his body stopped working, and he died. We won't see him again. Um, that is more like a more concrete way of saying it. We also want to make sure that there is a consistent message, so everyone using the same words and communicating the same thing. So if one person says died and another person says lost, that can lead to confusion. A person might think, well, maybe they're lost and they'll still come back when they find their way home, right? Another thing is that sometimes a person might need reassurance that they're safe. So they might worry that they are going to die as well. And in this situation, I think it would help to highlight the difference between sick and healthy. And we want to remember that it's supposed to ache. We can't take the ache away, and we shouldn't try to. What we can do is offer opportunities to grieve, process, and remember or honor the person. So let's take a look at an example story. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read through it, and then I'm just going to go back really quickly and talk about some of the ways that you might individualize something like this. And I am going to provide you with the PowerPoint for this story so that you could use and customize it. So this story is Goodbye, Grampy, and it's just an example. Grampy loved me very much. We would have tea together, and Grampy would visit me at my house every Saturday. Then Grampy got very sick. Grampy's body stopped working, and Grampy died. We won't see Grampy anymore. It's okay to feel sad, mad, and to miss Grampy. We won't see Grampy anymore, but we can look at pictures, and we can have tea together and remember good things about Grampy. So I'm just going to go back to the beginning, and we can talk about a few things. So you'll see I put notes below each of the pictures, and those are just little reminders for some ways that you could individualize this. If you were going to make a story like this, you would use an actual picture of the person here. You would also use an actual picture here, and if you had a picture, it would be nice if it was a picture of them doing something like hugging, but otherwise you could use a picture and a heart. Here we're talking about some of the activities that they would do together. So in this example, they would have tea and would have a visit at their house every Saturday. So we're acknowledging the routine and the activities they would do together. And again, for both of these, if you had them, you would use actual pictures. Sometimes you don't, and you just have to do the best that you can, and that's okay too. And for this picture, if you had a picture of the person, for example, visiting in the hospital, that's something that you could use here. And for this picture, you want to make sure that the one that's actually talking about death, you want to make sure that you're using a picture that the person will understand. You know, for example, a friend and someone I used to support would understand this picture because they go to a grave and they visit someone who has passed away. So they understand a grave as related to death. But not everyone will. So in some situations, using a picture of a casket could be helpful, or a funeral. I would say something that you could use as a last resort if a person doesn't have any previous understanding of a picture that you might use for death, is you could put a red X over a person as a last resort. But yeah, for this one, definitely in particular, you want to make sure that you're matching it to the way the person would understand death. We won't see Grampy anymore, and there's different ways you could express this. This is just one way I chose. You could also put like something about seeing, like eyes and an X and then the person. But you just want to make sure that you're using a picture of the person. And it's okay to feel sad, mad, and to miss Grampy. And here you could use this picture, or you can use, if you already have established emotion pictures, you would use those. And if you have a picture of a photo book or photos on a phone, like if the person would look on a phone, you could use a picture of the phone, or however they would actually look at the pictures. And in this picture, you would use an actual picture of whatever the activity was. Yeah. So this is just an example. There's many other ways a visual story could look. Okay. So just a few things that we want to avoid is saying things like they're in a better place, and anything that starts with at least. So what could that look like? At least they died at home, or at least they died quickly, or at least, you know, this other thing didn't happen. Typically, anything that starts with at least is just a no-go zone. Another thing is, I know how you feel. So while we may have experienced a similar loss, we really can't ever know how another person feels. And yeah, we really never know how another person feels and the magnitude of their loss. So that's just something we would avoid. And just to reiterate, we would avoid saying anything abstract. So again, that's things like, you know, they're lost, they're sleeping, they're an angel now, um, passed, passed on. For some people too, a really common one is they're in heaven now. And for many people, some people would be very understanding of that, and many people really wouldn't have any understanding of that. So if you're using a phrase like that, you just want to make sure that they have a solid understanding of heaven as a place that they believe in after death. Um, Something else I've heard is they're with Jesus now. And in this particular case, this person was raised in a very religious Baptist family, and they were able to understand that and get comfort from that. So it wasn't abstract for them, but for most people, something like that would likely be very abstract and wouldn't too much to them. Okay, so what are some of the things that we can do to support some more things that we can do to support the process of mourning? So one thing that I want to say right off the top is that all of the support that we provide for the process of mourning or grieving should be person directed. So just to quickly explain what I mean by person directed is, I guess I'll just use my usual example. Let's say there's someone named Jack, and Jack has an amazing support team. Maybe he lives in a small options home or a supported environment, and he has this amazing team. And this team gets together at a staff meeting, and they're like, we want to do something really awesome for Jack. We want he already has a great life, but we want it to be even better. So what's something we can do? And they're like, Jack loves going to the movies, loves going to the movies. So how about we take Jack to the movies every Tuesday? And then they go to Jack and they're like, hey, Jack, we're going to go to the movies every Tuesday. Let's go. So that's person-centered. That's person-centered support. They're taking Jack's preferences, his likes and values and all that stuff, and they're using that to make decisions relating to his support. In person directed support, what they would do differently is they would go to Jack and they would be like, hey, Jack, we were thinking that, there might be some more things that you would like to do or have in your life. What do you think about these options? And maybe it's the movies, the museum, I don't know, going to the waterfront. I don't know. And then they present Jack with his options, and then he's like, oh yeah, I'd love to go to the movies every week, right? Um, the difference is, so that's person directed. His support team is taking direction from Jack, right? And that's the kind of way that we want to approach the grieving process. So as we're going through all of this stuff, I'm not going to name it at every step, but just know that all of it should be person directed. And I think on the next slide, maybe or maybe the one after that, I am going to share an example of what that can look like for a person that doesn't communicate in more traditional or typical ways. So I'm going to share with you a visual support. Okay, so if we're supporting someone through the process of mourning, one of the hardest things is we want to remember that we can't fix grief. What we can do is be present, acknowledge the loss, and create as safe a space as possible to mourn. It's harder than we might think to avoid trying to fix things. And self-regulation for us will be particularly important because it's hard to see someone that we care about hurting. It might bring up our own experiences with loss as well. And it's also possible that the person that we're supporting might communicate in ways that are challenging to us. So, self-regulation. It's also possible that we're supporting someone through loss while we're also experiencing loss. And it's okay to express that we're sad and grieving as well. And sometimes it's giving the people we support an incredible gift to be able to share in the grieving together. And while this isn't shared grieving per se, I did one time, I was working in a small options home and I had to stop in. I was on my way, it was a home that I managed, and I was on my way out of the province to say goodbye to my dying grandmother. And I had to stop into the house for something. And one of the people that we supported came to me and was like, what are you doing? And I explained that, well, I'm going for a drive and I'm going to New Brunswick and I need to give my Grammy a hug and say goodbye because she's dying. And the person, who's my friend now, but just gave me the biggest hug and just understood in that moment, like, this is what I do. I want to give her comfort. And he gave me the hugest and most meaningful hug. And I felt like it was a gift for me as a person because someone who cares about me is trying to comfort me. But also, it was a gift for him to be able to offer that comfort to another person, right? So I guess I just wanted to share that the people we support can also be a comfort to us, right? Um, all that being said, whether we're experiencing the loss or not, we'll want to make sure that we're self-regulating. And this means doing what we need in order to feel grounded and calm. And this sets the stage for us to be able to co-regulate with the person we're supporting. It is helpful to participate in bereavement rituals. So that's things like funerals, wakes, memorials, sacred fires, burials, and gatherings. I do believe and find that in general, it is a lot harder to grieve well in isolation. So grief is something that's meant to be shared with others, and that's one of the reasons that participating in bereavement rituals with others can be very, very helpful, aside from the closure aspect and other things. But what's more important than any of that is making sure that a person has choice, right? So being able to have voice, choice, and control over what their mourning process looks like. So forcing someone to go to a bereavement ritual, may not be the way to go, right? We want to make sure that they understand the choice and are offered a choice offered the choice in a way that they can understand. And you can see when a person has to make that choice, how helpful it is to have done the work before that so that they can understand um, loss and death and grief, right? Because if you're trying to teach it in the moment when they've experienced loss, it's I guess that's not the moment when we best learn, right? Okay. Some other things that we can do is we want to make sure that the person's able to communicate about the loss in whatever ways they're most comfortable communicating. So maybe that's through talking, maybe that's through visuals. For some people, that's art. It might be signing. Um, I know somebody who can listen to music and will sing along with the music, but will make up their own words in relation to what they're thinking and feeling. And that's one of the ways that they communicate about loss and other things in their life, um, which I also think is a huge talent, being able to just, uh, you know, make up the words that go along with the song in relation to what you're feeling in the moment. Like, that's incredible improv skills. Um, yeah. So we want to make sure that we're providing whatever supports a person needs in order for this to happen. Um, and we also need to make sure that the person has a means to communicate their needs, wants, and preferences surrounding how they're grieving. So having this voice, choice, and control is very, very important. And again, I'm going to show you an example of what this could look like on the next slide. Another thing that we will want to do when supporting someone in mourning is reduce or eliminate demands. And while we're doing that, we also want to minimize change. And I know that that can sound a little bit like a paradox, but in practice, it could look like um, maybe every Monday, the person you support meets a friend at a coffee shop. And, to be able to meet the person at the coffee shop, they have to, of course, get dressed, get ready, get in the car, get all their stuff, go over to the coffee shop. So those are a number of demands. So maybe what it could look like if the person wanted is maybe the friend goes over to the house to have the coffee so that they're still seeing each other, they're still having coffee together, it's still on the right day, but it's reducing the demands of having to go out and everything associated with that. But again, person directed, some people might not like any change in the routine whatsoever. Yes. We need to make sure that we're supporting any of the secondary losses that we can, that we identified earlier in the process. And, for example, if the only time someone got to visit their Grammy was at dad's house and dad passed away, we'd want to make sure that there was another way arranged to be able to see Grammy so that they're not both losing um, their dad and access to their Grammy. If a person always did this specific activity with someone, we want to make sure that they'll be able to do that activity when they feel ready to. Yeah. We'll also need to remember that some dates and times of the year will be harder than others. So holidays, birthdays, the anniversary or season of the loss, and if there were yearly traditions or activities. All are things that might bring about a wave of grief, and we'll want to acknowledge that. Okay, so here's an example visual support that you could need to have someone be able to communicate what they need and want in the moment. And this is basically a choice board. And some people will like to have all 6 choices. Some people would prefer to only have 3. There's no right answer there, only what's right for the person. And here are some examples of what might go on, like what some of the options could be. So maybe the person might need to make a plan and know what's going on. Maybe they need to have a snack or a hug, or maybe they need a little extra sleep. If you were going to use this, you would make sure that you are individualizing it for the person you support, and make sure that it has options that the person would appreciate and want and need. Yeah, these are just a few examples. And this isn't just useful in the grieving process. It can be useful definitely in everyday life. I was talking to someone earlier and we were sharing about how, yeah, having something like this could be useful for us too. And I definitely believe that. I think my husband would believe that if he could just show me a few choices when I'm hangry. I think he would like that. Okay, so now let's look at some rituals of mourning that we could do with the person we support. And I'll share as well, there is a really good and helpful book on this. Can't remember what it's called, but I will include it in the email that I send out in the list of books. And it's the entire book is pretty much examples of rituals of mourning that could be done with the person with an intellectual disability. Um, and again, all of this should be person directed. So they should be able to direct their grieving process, but it's definitely okay to offer choices and ideas. So ideally, if the loss is a death, the person will have had the opportunity to grieve with others and to be a part of the more formal bereavement process, like a funeral or a burial. But not everyone will want to or be able to. But ideally, they're offered the choice and the supports that they need if they want to do so. So other than like the funeral, the wake, the burial, what are some other rituals of mourning that can be supportive? Making art. So that could be making art about the loss, about the person, about how they feel. Really, like anything that they feel like making art about will be relevant in the moment. Another one is making or telling stories. So that's telling or listening to stories about the person who they lost. Planting a memorial garden that they can tend or that they can watch grow. Another thing is doing activities that they did with the person. So a really simple example might be if a person always made cookies, there may come a time when it's helpful to make cookies together. And while you're doing that, remember the person or talk about the person while making them. Another one is making a remembering book. So that could be photos, a place to write down memories, to make drawings or art of any kind. Another example is making a remembering place. So that can be a place where the person can sit and remember the person. It can have pictures, items that are meaningful, art, or anything else that feels right to the person. Some people even like to talk out loud to the person at their remembering place. Another thing that could be done is writing a letter or making a visual story together. Some people find it very, very therapeutic to write a letter to someone who's passed away. Another one that's really, really accessible to many people is listening or making music about the person, or even making a playlist of music that reminds them of the person that they lost. And they can listen to that when they're thinking of them. Dance can be really helpful as well. Some of my personal rituals of mourning are having remembrance meals. So my friends or family will sometimes gather for a meal, and we'll serve our loved ones' favorite meals, and we'll set places for them at the table, and then we'll tell stories and we'll remember our loved ones. Other ones are visiting grave sites, telling stories about my loved ones that I've lost. Painting pictures is a big one for me. And culturally, something that we do is we build cairns. So that would be, you know, building piles of memorial rocks in remembrance of somebody who has passed away. Yes. So those are a few examples. And again, there are some more in the resource that I'm going to share that that organization Scope in the UK put together. And I'll share the name of that book that has, it's just a whole book of different examples of rituals of mourning, and it's really great. Yes. Okay. So today we've talked about what grief is and what it can look like, how to talk about death and loss in a supportive way, and some supportive strategies and rituals of mourning. And before we get into questions and discussions, I just want to offer you some invitations. So if you want to connect with us for any reason, our email address is askus@allaboutinclusion.ca. And you can also visit our website, which is allaboutinclusion.ca. We love to collaborate. So if you have this, an idea or a project that you want to collaborate on, we're very, very open to hearing about that. So don't hesitate to send us an email. Some of the things that we offer are in-person and online training and coaching. And that is on the paid side of things. So we offer in-person and online training for things like for example, we can do something like this, one of our webinars for your organization or presentation. We also do full day or half day training on things like supported decision-making, visual communication, autism, sensory support, and co-regulation, and much, much more. We also have a whole catalog of online self-paced courses. And at some point in the future, we are going to add a more in-depth one on grief and grieving. But for the time being, you can find those on our website. And we do expect that organizations pay to access them, but individuals with disabilities and families, we do offer them pay what you can. So we want to be very accessible for individuals and families, so individuals with disabilities and their families. So if finances are a barrier to taking our courses online, just send us an email and we can help you access them for whatever cost is accessible to you. We also develop organization-specific trainings and customize them to whatever you need them to be. We develop tailored resources for people and organizations. So, for example, that could be tailored visual supports. We also specialize in planning and implementation services. So what some of the things that looks like is helping people make a building community plan and then support for how to implement that. It could also look like, a plan for someone experiencing a loss or many other different things. Yes. And now I would love to open it up for questions. And